E.G.G. Egregious Games.
Tomb of Lime recently did a video about elegance in RPG mechanics, and he basically got into what I would consider the principal engineering problem when it comes to designing any tabletop game. How to get the maximum cool stuff out of the minimum fuckaboutery. Fuckaboutery being upkeep, complexity, and annoying parts of the game that you don't find fun. Cool stuff being a fun range of outcomes. He uses the term granularity, but I'm also just going to include anything that's fun or engaging about the game. And I'm using my own terms here because I do think that while he's onto something, there is a hidden aspect, something I think is under talked about in RPG design, and that is feel. Now, game feel is a common term when talking about video games, but not so much when talking about tabletop games. And I think that's because it's easy to talk about things like smoothness of how your character moves in an action game and things like that, but it's not quite as obvious to map game feel to an abstract experience like role-playing or strategy games. But it is absolutely underrated in importance for these games. And I could talk about how rulebooks convey information and how that affects your experience of a game, but Mr. Carts basically already just did a video about that. I want to talk specifically about game feel as it pertains to dice mechanics. Dice feel, if you want to put it that way. So take a d20 roll. There's a reason d20 is the standard. Rolling a d20 is exciting because there's a wide range of possible results, and it's immediate, zero friction. In most d20 systems, you'll also add a bonus. Then you compare it to a difficulty, and you get success or failure. Pretty simple. Contrast that with something like GURPS. GURPS uses a 3d6 roll under system, and it's interesting how immediately trying to roll underscore rather than roll over changes the feel. Because in most roll under systems, a bigger number is better when it comes to stats, scores, and so on, but a smaller number is better on the dice. And for some people, that's not a big deal. For others, that feel is a bit jarring. It's just not smooth on the brain. It's rough. And that's kind of qualitative information. That's not something you can understand just by looking at complexity versus granularity. Let's also talk about one die versus multiple dice. One die is, like I said before, immediate. You immediately know whether it's a good or a bad result. Instant feedback. With multiple dice, you usually have to perform some kind of mental operation, so it's delayed feedback. However, what you get in return is that wider range of outcomes. With multiple dice, you can represent extremely unlikely outcomes like 1 in 100 or even less. Now consider I could just roll a d100, but then we're immediately into much larger numbers, and the brain just doesn't like that. It's more fuckaboutery. The 3d6 is actually pretty elegant if you want your results to trend strongly towards an average. And why might we want that? Why might we want a curve rather than a flat range of outcomes? Well, one reason is that real-life actions usually don't have such a flat probability range. I don't slice my hand open 1 in 20 times when I try to cut an onion. When I make a batch of chili, most times it's going to be average, or maybe a little better or worse than usual. And then, less frequently, I make a batch that's really great or really meh, and every once in a while, you really knock it out of the park or you fuck it up completely. So by representing this right in the core dice resolution mechanic, we are actually bringing the mechanics and the fiction closer together. And the type of fiction GURPS wants is a somewhat more believable fiction. Let's contrast that with Savage Worlds. In Savage Worlds, you roll multiple dice, but you generally ignore the smaller dice result. That makes resolution fast, more immediate like a d20, but it also introduces the concept of exploding dice. Basically, if you ever roll the highest number on a die, you take that number and then you roll again, adding it to the total. And your dice can explode multiple times. And you can typically re-roll by spending resources called bennies. Because of exploding dice, there is essentially no ceiling for how high you can roll in Savage Worlds. And for every 4 you exceed the target number by, you get a raise, which means you deal an additional wound, or you just succeed harder. It is very possible to get one-hit kills in Savage Worlds just from sheer luck. The system is less about seeing if you succeed or fail, and more about seeing how well you're going to succeed. And Savage Worlds leans hard into this idea that if you're a player character, you're already a badass. It's not going for simulationism, it wants to feel like Indiana Jones, where you can fight like 10 dudes because you're just the main character and they're not. Because those dudes don't have multiple dice just for being cool. They have their own rules, their own mechanics, which ensures that they will never be as important or as cool as you are. It's not tied to the fictional reality so much as it's tied to the kind of fictional genre Savage Worlds wants to evoke. It wants to feel like Mad Max or Star Wars. Savage Worlds actually de-emphasizes the importance of your traits, because no matter how high or low your attributes are, you still have a pretty great chance of success just by getting lucky. And while exploding dice don't lend themselves to balance particularly, they do lend themselves to a sense of crazy escalation and over-the-top outcomes. Hence, where GURPS feels like a simulation, Savage Worlds feels like a slot machine. I want to talk about one final example, and that's Fate. Fate is a generic storytelling system that uses fudge dice. A fudge dice is essentially a 3-sided die where you can roll a plus, a minus, or a nil. And in Fate, you roll 3 of these dice for a possible result of anywhere from -3 to +3. And that modifies your own skill rating. It tells you whether you do better or worse than usual for your character. It is actually, like GURPS, more tied to your character's skills and abilities than something like Savage Worlds. Because that baseline, that 0 result, is what you're going to most commonly get. What this means is that Fate lends itself to immersing in the fiction. What's funny is that when it comes to pure dice mechanics, Fate and GURPS actually have a lot more in common with each other than they do with D&D or Savage Worlds, even though Fate is considered a fairly rules-light game, and GURPS is considered a rules-heavy game. That's mostly because of all the extra rules in GURPS and the fact that Fate has very few rules outside of its core resolution system. But we're just comparing core dice mechanics. They share this idea that you're going to get an average or near average result most of the time. But what I would add in the case of Fate is that these dice make the outcome feel very immediate and very easily translated into the fiction. If you get a -1, you know that's worse than average for your character. It is literally a negative number you are subtracting from your character's average result, which is just their skill rating. When that outcome exists, getting a plus to your die actually feels more exciting because it's not guaranteed to happen. Because those pluses and minuses on the dice are immediately visible and easy to grok, that feedback is instantaneous. This obviously comes at the cost of granularity, because your results only range from a -3 to a +3. What this means is that you can't just give out modifiers like a +1 willy-nilly, or the game breaks down. The game relies on other systems and meta currencies to decide whether or not you can actually get that +1. What this means is that Fate ends up de-emphasizing tangible considerations like cover or range, and instead it puts more emphasis on what the characters do to achieve those modifiers. Is that better or worse than GURPS? It's a matter of taste. I wanted to make this video because I think this aspect of game feel, of dice feel, can often go overlooked when we're designing games. What dice you roll and how you interpret them is just as important as how Mario's jump feels, or that little moment of hit stop when you land a heavy in Street Fighter. It's not just about the math, it's about how it feels to go through the process of using that mechanic. Is it immediate? Is it fun? Is it tactile? Both the good and bad thing about dice feel from a designer's perspective is that people can be very arbitrary about what they like and don't like. You might love the fudge die, but for other people, it just doesn't give them the same excitement as a D20. And this, unfortunately, is not something you can just fix. You can't convince people to enjoy something that they don't. But that doesn't mean these things aren't worth considering. Quite the contrary. As game designers, it's really easy to think in pure theory, but sometimes it's also useful to listen to our gut. Because sometimes you're working on your game, and you make some change or add some new mechanic, and it seems, on paper, like it should be an improvement. Like, I made the thing more granular without increasing the complexity, but for some reason it just doesn't feel right. You might soldier on, ignoring your gut feeling. And this can go on for quite some time. There was a time during the development of Crossguard where I decided the D10s were not granular enough. I needed to switch to a 2D20 system. And I spent a bunch of time working in this new system, and the whole time I felt very non-committal about the process. It was like on an intellectual level, I knew that 2D20 was better, but on a gut level, I was like, something about this just feels rough to use. Now, do I regret the time I spent doing that? No, because going down that road, wasting that time, helped me understand why the original system was good. Because I was so miserable using the new dice system, it motivated me to find new ways to do what I wanted without it. And I did. But if I had just soldiered on, looking only at the maths on paper, I might have wasted a lot more time. Now, I have really just scratched the surface of this topic. And that's because I wanted to respond to Matt from Tomb of Lime, and I wanted to talk specifically about dice feel, not just overall game feel. But this is something I will definitely be talking about more in the future. So if there are any more games where you want me to talk about those mechanics, mention them below, and maybe they'll make it into the next video. So stay tuned, thanks for watching, and have yourself a great rest of your day.